I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Denise Jorgens. I'm the Director of Programs and External Relations here at International House. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of International House, as well as our other partners in the World Beyond the Headlines lecture series, which includes the Center for International Studies here at the University of Chicago, the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this final lecture program in this year's World Beyond the Headlines series. Tonight's event is being audio and video recorded for broadcast on the web. The lecture will be available to download at no charge. You will be able to access the recording in about 3 weeks by visiting the University of Chicago's International and Area Studies Multimedia Outreach Source, Kiosmos, at kiosmos.uchicago.edu. You can also link to this site from the Center for International Studies website on the University of Chicago site. For tonight's World Beyond the Headlines program, we welcome Ahmed Rashid, here to discuss with us his new book, Descent into Chaos, the United States and the Failure of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Ahmed Rashid is a Pakistani journalist and best-selling author based in Lahore. He was the Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review for 22 years until the magazine was recently closed. He presently writes for numerous publications, including the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal. He is also the author of 3 books: Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil and Fundamentalism in Central Asia; Jihad, The Rise of Militant Islam in Central Asia; and The Resurgence of Central Asia, Islam or Nationalism. Please join me in welcoming Ahmed Rashid.
Well, thank you very much for coming here today. I mean, it's such a beautiful day. I thought, I wouldn't have anyone to speak to, but it's very kind of you to come. And I hear that, this is a last week. Exams are going on, and special thanks to the students who are here. I wrote the Taliban book, which kind of summarized everything up to 9/11 almost, and it's taken me 4 years to write this book. For a variety of reasons, but if you see the kind of panorama that I'm trying to draw, not only what has happened, everything that has happened, I hope, since 9/11, but what was happening in Washington, in European capitals, at the UN, as well as my own reporting from the ground up in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. I hope, this will be, I hope it's readable, and I hope it's understandable. I'm going to, briefly start with 9/11, where the book starts, and just tell you, as far as, my thesis as to, where things started going wrong. I think in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and the planning for the war in Afghanistan, it was clear that the U.S. enjoyed some incredible advantages, if you like, or positives. The tragedy and the story of the whole book is basically, the tragedy was that very quickly these positives were turned into negatives by this administration. Partly due to Iraq, because of the diversion that Iraq presented itself, but also just due to wrong decision-making. 4 major things that what I saw, what was extremely positive that the Bush administration went into this war with. The first was that they had complete international support. This was not a war of choice. It was not a war. This was a war that was fully backed by the whole world. The whole world was horrified by what had happened in 9/11. And that international coalition it was NATO and other European countries, other armies wanted to support the US, and essentially the US said, no, we're going to do this unilaterally, we're going to do this, we're going to make a coalition of the willing, of those countries who we want rather than the world. So I think a huge opportunity was lost there in being able to get the world acting together, not only to win the war, but in the post-reconstruction effort. The second big positive was that for the sake of the war, the US constructed a very important and effective regional alliance, that is the neighbors of Afghanistan. Now, if you remember in the 90s, all the neighbors of Afghanistan had been interfering in Afghanistan, backing one side or the other. The Pakistanis had backed the Taliban, the Iranians, the Central Asians, the Russians. India had backed the Northern Alliance, and that had only helped fuel the civil war. But for this war, there was a very effective alliance of all the regional countries, and that included India and Pakistan working together to facilitate the arrival of US troops in the region. The Central Asian states, where the Americans set up were allowed to set up 3 major bases in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and even Iran. Senior U.S. officials were talking to Iran about, helping in the war effort, and there was immense cooperation with Iran. But immediately after the war, almost willingly, unfortunately, this administration decided to break up this coalition. The war ended in December 2001. By January within 4 weeks, Iran was dubbed the Great Satan, along with North Korea and Syria, and almost, all dialogue ceased with Iran. India and Pakistan nearly went to war. For the whole of 2002, there was extreme tension between the two countries. And if you remember, there was almost a chance, the fear of nuclear war between the two countries. So the coalition broke up, and with the coalition breaking up, all these countries decided to go back to what they'd been doing in the 90s, which was to back one side or the other in the Afghan conflict. And one result of that, of course, was for Pakistan to give sanctuary to the escaping Taliban leadership. Sorry. The third major positive was that the Afghan people welcomed the overthrow of the Taliban. They welcomed the presence of American troops. And if you remember, this was in the U.S. media at the time, there was this thing that, the Afghans, they kicked out the British, they kicked out the Russians, they'll never tolerate foreign troops, we should not be there, we should just stay there a short time and parcel it out to someone else. But in fact, the Afghans wanted the foreign troops. Why? Because it was the presence of foreign troops, they thought, that would guarantee the reconstruction and rebuilding of their country. That, with the foreign troops, money would come, the Americans would get involved, and, their lives would change. And unfortunately, that didn't happen either. Because at least for the first 3 years after the war ended, the Americans almost immediately started planning for Iraq and then fighting the war in Iraq. And Afghanistan took a very low second priority as far as this administration was concerned. And without American leadership, other countries were also not really encouraged to put their weight behind a big reconstruction effort. So I think the Afghan people gave the West, the Americans, a window of opportunity which lasted for almost 3 years, 4 years. I mean, a window of opportunity to come in and help rebuild their country. And it never really happened effectively. And after that, once the Taliban insurgency restarted in 2003, the Taliban were able to use this as a propaganda ploy by going to the people and saying, look, we told you, these damn foreigners, they're going to come here, they have no intentions to rebuild the country, and we are the real guardians of the people, etc., etc. So I think that was a huge missed opportunity. And the fourth a major mistake, which was made by the Bush administration, was But after the war ended, within 3 months of the war ending, almost all the too few resources that the Bush administration had put into Afghanistan, if you remember, there were just about 1,000 troops there in the beginning. In fact, there were far too few troops there. Commanders on the ground, U.S. commanders on the ground, were begging Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz to send more troops. But they were refusing. Within 3 months, some of the best resources, the special forces, the intelligence, the satellite surveillance, all the best resources were taken out of Afghanistan and sent for retraining for the Iraq invasion. So what really happened was that this administration decided that we will, as this vacuum is created in the countryside because of the lack of U.S. presence and the lack of international forces, we will empower the warlords. Now, the Afghan warlords were those same warlords who, in the 90s, had created the civil war and whom the Taliban had originally kicked out. And the Taliban, if you remember, back in '94, was seen as the good guys because they were, kicking, disarming, and then kicking out, defeating, and kicking out these warlords. And all these warlords then came back. And they were put on the CIA payroll, and they were given arms, and they were told to keep the peace in the countryside and help us find bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Except there were two problems with this. First of all, half the warlords were in bed with al-Qaeda. They were taking money from al-Qaeda as well as taking money from the Americans. So they were least likely to facilitate the hunt for bin Laden. And secondly, the warlords had this terrible reputation amongst the people. And the public was absolutely in despair that within months these rapacious, greedy, harassing warlords were back in their localities, harassing people, attacking women, seizing property, seizing flocks of sheep and goats. Instead of keeping the peace, they became the major cause for the breakdown of law and order. So this policy to keep warlords on the U.S. payroll, which went on until 2004, until the presidential elections in Afghanistan, was a hugely detrimental policy. And that too, of course, encouraged the Taliban. Now, at the same time, let me just surmise two major mistakes that the U.S. made with Pakistan and with Pervez Musharraf. Pervez Musharraf, an army general who had seized power in 1999 through a coup, considered a pariah government until 9/11, because the moment 9/11 happened, he was needed desperately because Pakistan was the only entry point for, or a major entry point for American troops. So Musharraf became extremely important. He was given an ultimatum to stop Pakistan's support to the Taliban, which he did so temporarily. U.S. forces were based in Pakistan, and a lot of the supplies and men, etc., that went into Afghanistan went through Pakistan. Now, two mistakes, I think, two major mistakes were made. The first was that in 2002, once the war had ended, the Taliban, unfortunately, and al-Qaeda had never been defeated in Afghanistan. They were routed. They were scattered, but they were never defeated. And they regrouped. Some of them went back to their villages, but most of them escaped across the border into Pakistan. And very quickly, the military regime and its intelligence arm, the inter-services intelligence, organized their housing and their sanctuary in Pakistan. Now, what was the reason for this? Well, the Pakistani military feared two things. They didn't like the government in Kabul because they considered the government in Kabul as being too pro-American and too pro-India. India, if you remember, is the historic enemy of Pakistan. We fought 3 wars with it, etc., etc. And secondly, they wanted to keep the Taliban as a proxy force. There was enormous, there was real concern that, the Americans might just up and go because the Americans were not deploying troops in Afghanistan. They weren't showing a commitment to nation building or to reconstruction. So the feeling was that if the Americans go, then Pakistan should have its proxy force there to take over in Kabul. In other words, a rehash of another Taliban regime. Even though the Taliban, of course, by now were fully associated with bin Laden and al-Qaeda, etc. So the US compounded this issue by telling the Pakistanis that we are now busy in Iraq. Don't bother us about anything. Just hunt down Al-Qaeda for us. And the more you capture or kill the Arab component of Al-Qaeda, we'll reward you. Money, weapons, arms, intelligence cooperation, etc. And we're not concerned about the Taliban. We don't care what happens to the Taliban. We're not interested in capturing or killing the Taliban leadership. You can do what you like with them. So in a sense, the Pakistani military fulfilled what was part of the US agenda. Go for the Taliban, which Musharraf did. He captured large numbers of Arabs and senior members of Al-Qaeda. One who's on trial right now, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who organized the whole 9/11 attack. He was captured in Pakistan. But with the Taliban, the Pakistanis were essentially told, we really don't care what you do with the Taliban. Now, the reaction in Kabul, of course, was very different. The Afghans kept coming to Washington, and Karzai came to Washington several times and urged President Bush. He said, look, I mean, the problem, Al-Qaeda is not going to overthrow my government. Al-Qaeda is not the threat to the Afghan people. There are a few hundred there. They may be planning attacks abroad in America, in Europe. But the real threat to my regime is the Taliban and the revival of the Taliban. And that is taking place on Pakistani soil. And what are you doing about it? And Bush, at that point in time, the administration was, totally preoccupied with Iraq, and it was not interested in anything else except the capture of Al-Qaeda. Now, the second big mistake I think the administration made with Pakistan was simply that in 2002, Musharraf was a dictator, a military ruler. He was seeking the means to legitimize his rule. And in 2002, he held a rigged a referendum in which he stood. He was the only candidate to stand for president. He held a referendum which was massively rigged. The turnout was about 10-15%. It was billed that the turnout was about 70-80% in favor of Musharraf. And right after that, he held elections, which were also heavily rigged. And the elections brought to power at the center, in the central government, a political party which was made up of politicians who were loyal to the army. And all the opposition parties were basically ousted. Many of the opposition leaders were in exile already because of the military coup, but the opposition parties were kept out. And most dangerously of all, in the two bordering provinces of Baluchistan and the Northwest Frontier Province, which border Afghanistan, Islamic fundamentalist parties came to power. And these parties were, in fact, allies of the Taliban. So the whole facilitation of giving the Taliban sanctuary was made much easier because you had now a legitimate provincial government in these two provinces which were able to facilitate their accommodation and their feeding and, all the rest of it. So these were the two mistakes made with Pakistan. Not putting enough pressure on Musharraf, who at that time could have carried through a genuine return to some kind of democratic rule, if not entirely, but certainly a kind of partnership with a genuine government, a genuine civilian government, and the military. And secondly, no pressure on the Pakistanis' decision to give sanctuary to the Taliban. Now, I'm going to skip what happened in the middle, which you can all read about, but I'd be happy to answer questions, and I want to now come to the present day. So where have all these mistakes led to? And what are we faced with today? Well, today, as you know, we have a full-blooded Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. Up to 1/3 of the country, basically of the countryside, is in the hands of the Taliban, especially in the south and the east of the country, where the Taliban are basically come from the Pashtun ethnic group, which is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. But there are 3 times more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. So the Pashtuns also have a common ethnic bond with the Pashtun. The Taliban also have a common ethnic bond with the Pashtuns in Pakistan. And of course, the fact that Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, there were several groups who were allied to the Taliban. There were Central Asian groups who were fighting with the Taliban against the Americans, who also retreated into Pakistan. There were Chechens. There were Chinese Muslims. they all gathered along the Pakistan border, and for 4 years, until 2004, they were not touched at all, basically. Most of the Pakistani arrests of Al-Qaeda took place not in the tribal areas which go along the border, but actually in Pakistani cities. So what we see is this conglomeration of all these extremist groups along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border really having a free hand. The Americans on that side didn't have enough troops to, patrol the whole border or occupy the whole border. The Pakistanis on this side were allowing this to happen and didn't send their troops in. So we first of all today have a full-thrown Taliban insurgency. They have now become far more sophisticated than before. They're learning from Iraq. Al-Qaeda has facilitated their coming and going with Iraq, so that they're learning all these tactics that the Iraqi Al-Qaeda and others have been using there, IEDs, new types of mines, explosives, ambushes, all this kind of thing are now being used in Afghanistan. Most lethal of all has been the introduction of suicide bombers. Last year there were 140 suicide bombings in Afghanistan in 2007. There have been something like 40 this year alone. And there are hundreds of young men they've recruited for suicide bombing. They have taken advantage of the drugs trade in Afghanistan. Now, the drugs trade, the expansion of the drugs trade in Afghanistan was also due to the failure of reconstruction, because there was no investment in agriculture. Farmers were left, there were 2.5 million refugees went back to Afghanistan after 9/11. They were left with no investment. There was no, nobody was building water or roads or, new seeds, fertilizer, etc., etc. So they went back to growing what was, it's poppy, which opium and heroin is derived from, is the easiest of crops because it doesn't need water, it doesn't need fertilizer, you can grow it on the most barren soil, and this is precisely what happened. And so the drugs trade has now increasingly been taken over by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So you have a very serious insurgency, which frankly has to some extent been checkmated militarily by the American forces there and by NATO. In 2004, finally, the Americans agreed, because they were bogged down in Iraq, they agreed for NATO troops to come into Afghanistan. So there are about 60,000 troops in Afghanistan, out of which about 30 or 35,000 are American. The rest are NATO troops from about 40 different countries. Now, so that's the situation in Afghanistan. So what's been happening in Pakistan? Well, in Pakistan, the tragedy was, and people like myself were pointing this out in 2002 and 2003, that in Pakistan, if the military allows the Afghan Taliban leadership and Al-Qaeda to seek sanctuary in Pakistan, you will be generating your own Taliban, which will be a threat to the Pakistani state. And that is precisely what has happened. I and other people were writing this back in 2003. And today we have a phenomenon which is called the Pakistani Taliban. Now, who are the Pakistani Taliban? The Pakistani Taliban were essentially Pashtun tribesmen who brought the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda into Pakistan after the war ended, after Tora Bora and the various, the attempts to escape Afghanistan. And these Pashtun tribesmen brought these people in, accommodated, gave them homes, gave them food, gave them supplies, put them in touch with other extremist groups in the cities, so that a lot of Al-Qaeda fled Pakistan and went back to the Middle East. So these Pakistani Pashtuns were essentially facilitators who helped Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban, and of course in that process became ideologized themselves, became Taliban themselves, and earned enormous sums of money from the services they were providing. And with those services, they hired bodyguards. Those bodyguards turned into militias. They were running horses and mules. The mules and horses turned into pickups, fleets of pickup trucks and jeeps. They bought heavy weapons. And suddenly you had multiple militias in the tribal areas made up of Pakistani Pashtun. And today, the Pakistani Pashtun are occupying most of the tribal areas, the 7 tribal agencies which are on the Pakistani side of the border. They are now infiltrating into the Northwest Frontier province. They have surrounded large numbers of towns. They're trying to subvert the villages around these towns and eventually will enter these towns. So a process of Talibanization, not through willingness, but through fear and harassment and terror, really, is now taking place in northwest Pakistan. So you have a really very, very serious issue there. Now, even this issue has still not, unfortunately, convinced the military that we need to dump the Afghan Taliban, we need to really resist the Taliban. Instead, the military is trying to sign peace deals with, you've probably been reading about this has been in the news a lot in the last few weeks. The Americans are extremely upset with this, and so is NATO. They're signing peace deals with the Pakistani Taliban. And the peace deals say 2 or 3 things. They allow the army to withdraw. So the army is in effect giving up sovereignty of part of its territory to these Pakistani Taliban. And these peace deals then force both sides to release prisoners, which means that the Taliban have been capturing and kidnapping army soldiers and bureaucrats and civilian officials. They're being freed, but in exchange, I mean, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda people being held by the Pakistani authorities are also being freed. But thirdly, which has really obviously annoyed the Americans, that these peace deals do not prevent in any way the Pakistani Taliban or the Afghan Taliban, all those living on the Pakistan side of the border, it doesn't prevent them from crossing the border and fighting the Americans in Afghanistan. And this is the crucial issue. And for the Pakistani Taliban, these peace deals make absolute strategic sense. We want to fight the Americans in Afghanistan. The best way is that we strike a peace deal with the Pakistan army. We don't attack the Pakistan army. The Pakistan army allows us control of all the tribal areas that we are living in. And we are then free to cross the border and attack Afghan forces and NATO and US forces across the border. So it is a very, very, so in both countries, as such, it's a very dire situation. I won't touch on Central Asia because, I mean, it's a different topic, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to answer questions about that. But exactly the same mistakes were made in Central Asia. Essentially, after 9/11, when the US set up these bases, the regimes in Central Asia are almost all complete dictatorships, almost from the Stalinist era. There's been no political reform, no economic reform in the 3 states bordering which are close to Afghanistan: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And the people initially, after 9/11, really welcomed the Americans because they thought that, like in Afghanistan, the Americans coming into this region will mean that, perhaps we'll have more democracy, we'll have more pressure on our government to kind of deliver more goods to the people, to carry out reforms, and the Americans will come with a political agenda which will allow foreign investment, etc., and, raise our standard of living. And of course, none of this happened because the Americans were only interested in setting up military bases and helping the intelligence agencies of these countries to become even stronger and more ruthless, not just with Al-Qaeda, but also with their own people. So Central Asia is now slipped into enormous problems of poverty and deprivation and increased dictatorship. And the crux of the issue was in 2006 when President Karimov of Uzbekistan massacred some 800 to 1,200 people in a city in Uzbekistan. And then even the Americans were forced to condemn that. And then Karimov shut down the US base there. Anyway, so this whole region, as you can see, I mean, it came into this war, the people of this region came into this war with one idea. The Western powers had a completely different idea. Really, the title of my book, The Failure of Nation Building, was based, on these premises that I've spoken about. Now, I just want to touch on a couple of issues. First is Iraq. I say very loudly in this book that Iraq is a sideshow compared to this part of the world. Now, why do I say that? I don't mean that Iraq is a sideshow for the American people, because, I mean, you know, you've suffered 4,000 dead there, something like 40,000 wounded, 300,000 of your troops have been through stress disorder and are suffering from mental illness because of their repeated deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. It has led to literally the cracking up of the U.S. military. It has led to a severe recession in the United States. It has led to the lack of attention to the social services here, all sorts of things that you know far better than I do. But Iraq essentially, hopefully, whoever the next president is, will be settled, and it will be settled as a regional issue. And what I mean by that is I think two things need to be done in Iraq. The first thing is that what this administration failed to do, as it did in Afghanistan, there needs to be an alliance of neighboring countries which agree to stabilize Iraq. And eventually Iraq is going to be settled by its own Arab neighbors, by the Arab world. But in this you will have to include Iran, you will have to talk to Iran to do this, Iran will have to be part of this alliance, and Israel will also. So there could also be positive spin-offs of this. Secondly, essentially the Arabs will have to be convinced that the Shia majority in Iraq will have to be the government. But the Sunnis will have to be well protected, and the Arab governments, who are largely Sunni, have to be convinced of this. Now, unfortunately, and once I think that alliance is in place, then you can talk from a position of much greater strength to the government in Iraq and tell them to get on with it and get on with stabilizing the country and dealing with extremists, and then you can eventually, the third stage would be you could start pulling out troops. Now, this administration does not have the capacity. It is not trusted. It is not liked. It is not trusted, and it's not willing to talk to two of the key neighbors, Syria and Iran. You can't settle Iraq without talking to Syria and Iran. Now, the other main reason. So, what I'm trying to say here is that Iraq is essentially a Middle East problem. It is going to be settled by the Middle East, by the Arab neighbors. It's going to be it could be part of a wider Middle East settlement, but essentially it will be settled by the neighbors. Secondly, most important of all, despite all the hype we heard, there are nuclear weapons in Iraq, Al-Qaeda's in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was, partner with Osama bin Laden in 9/11, etc., all which turned out to be untrue. The fact is, no international terrorist attack has ever been launched from Iraqi soil against Europe or anywhere else. Al-Qaeda is in Iraq, but Al-Qaeda has not, because of the US presence, has not had the capacity to seize territory and hold territory, as it is doing in the region I write about. Al-Qaeda has not had the capacity or the control to launch international terrorist attacks. It's brought in foreigners, but it has not been able, they've either died there or fought there or committed, carried out suicide bombings there. So what I say is that Iraq is not a global threat as such. Whereas the region that I'm writing about does pose an immense global threat, continually so. The Al-Qaeda leadership is there, and all these camps that are now on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border are training all sorts of people, including Americans, European Muslims, Africans, Asians, etc. In fact, by being able to seize territory and hold it, Al-Qaeda is essentially trying to rebuild the kind of facility it had in Afghanistan in the 90s, when Al-Qaeda basically controlled an entire country. So Iraq, as I say, I still see as a sideshow, and compared to the region. And unfortunately, there's just insufficient focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. In this presidential campaign, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have talked about it. They both said that they would focus much more on Afghanistan than the Bush administration has done. So I mean, we have to see if they come in and if they fulfill that. The Republican nominee, of course, is much more reluctant to talk about Afghanistan simply because Afghanistan is turning into an embarrassment. I think this administration really hoped that Afghanistan would be the success story that that could be touted as this big victory against terrorism. And, everybody's going to school, everybody's happy in Afghanistan, and that would boost the Republican chances of coming in. But I just don't see that happening, because Afghanistan is in the next 4 or 5 months, things are going to get much worse there rather than better. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I've had a request here briefly from some of you to talk about women in Afghanistan. Let me just touch on there have been extremely positive things happening in Afghanistan at the same time. Despite my overall thesis, the overall thesis is that the infrastructure was not rebuilt. The economy has not taken off because there was insufficient infrastructure to allow the economy to take off. But in the social sector, there has been huge improvement. Education, 6 million children are back to school. If you remember the Taliban period, girls were banned from school, boys schools were almost non-existent. Education has been enormously supported by the Afghan people, and particularly by women. Mothers have been, dying to send their children to school. 30%, or I think it's about 38% of the teachers are women. Now, I mean, you can imagine, coming out of 30 years of war, to about 7-8 years of Taliban rule, it's been a huge boost to, I think, women that women are working, women are studying, and then women are working. And obviously, the two biggest recruiting bases for women are education and health. The health sector has also had a lot of money pumped in. There's vastly improved health conditions, especially for women. I mean, for the first time, I think WHO is, the UN is reporting that more women are now giving birth in clinics and hospitals than, out in their mud houses. For the first time in Afghanistan's history. So, the social sector has generally seen, from zero or minus zero, it has seen an enormous improvement. The issue of women is very mixed across the country. Simply, there's been far more progress, obviously, in getting women into the workforce, getting women out into the streets in the urban areas, and in the non-Pashtun areas. It's been a much slower process in the Pashtun areas because of the presence of Taliban, because of a very conservative tribal tradition of the way you deal with women and basically treat women. But even I think one of the most important advances was, we've had presidential elections in 2004, and then we had parliamentary elections in 2005. 1/3 of the parliament is made up of women. Some of them directly elected, some of them nominated by the president or by other people. That is a huge, huge improvement for any Muslim country. And by the way, the literacy campaign, which was done with American help, and Laura Bush, to her credit, had a great deal to do with it in pushing it forward, although much of the money came from the Europeans. The literacy campaign has been the largest literacy campaign ever in a Muslim country. So I think it's enormously significant that from zero, or whatever it was 2% of the population were in school or something, at 9/11, and now, more than 60 or 70% of the children are back in school. So So the literacy campaign, the health campaign, and getting women in parliament. Of course, no Muslim country has so many women in parliament. And women took part in all these elections to a surprising degree, even in the Pashtun areas. Even though it was very... and the women insisted. I toured a lot in the Pashtun areas during the elections, and women were insisting. There were separate meetings where women would be agitating to, if husbands were refusing to let their wives vote, they were agitating to other women to make sure that all the women went. And so what happened was that in the most conservative areas, for example, the men would go in the morning and the women went in the afternoon together. So that there was no mixing of the genders. Anyway, so I think there has been, but obviously this Talibanization or the re-Talibanization poses an immense threat to women both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. What are the Taliban doing? They're burning down schools as the symbol, of as a symbol of American Reconstruction or Western Reconstruction, as a symbol of the government, and also to put women back in their place. That you have no business attending school or teaching there or whatever. This has been, so we if this Talibanization continues like that, and they're burning schools in Pakistan now too, they're burning boys' schools in Pakistan, which is extraordinary. And we have a much longer tradition than Afghanistan of girls, mixed education of girls and boys up to university level. I mean, we also, we have a much longer tradition which goes back to the whole British colonial era, etc. But they're burning down girls' schools there too. So I think we are faced with now a very critical region. I hope that the next administration is going to be able to focus on this. I fear very much what could happen in the next 12 months. It's going to be another 4 months for your election. It's going to be another. It's not till probably next spring or summer until the administration is really in place with all its people, etc., whoever wins the election. But I think there will have to be a lot of contingency planning and that there is no policy vacuum in this period of handover between November and next spring from Bush to the next president. Because this, the Taliban know fully well also that this is really the most vulnerable. This is the time when the US, when the world international community is at its most vulnerable in the midst of an American election. And this American handover of power which takes so long. And this is the time to strike. This is the time to, build up offensives in Pakistan, build up the offensive in Afghanistan, and make things so hot that one or two of these NATO countries may actually pull out. And if one or two of these NATO countries pull out their troops, then the whole NATO alliance comes crashing down. And the Americans are in no position to send more troops to Afghanistan because they don't have the troops to send to Afghanistan. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are strategizing to an enormous extent, I think, in the next 12 months. And I hope this administration does not leave a power vacuum and does not leave a legacy which would be catastrophic and which the next administration has to pick up the pieces of. I'll end here, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much indeed. Good. All right.
I wonder whether, in a way, to say that it's not so much the failure of nation building, but that nation building wasn't really tried, and that much as the Bush administration has been excoriated for the arrogance of spreading democracy, its real failure was that it didn't spread democracy and supported Musharraf far too long. So I wonder what your advice would be now that there is the more people in the Pakistan parliament who would be in favor of exerting control over the army, the Pakistan army. How could the United States facilitate such a process of helping more democratic forces in Pakistan deal with the Pakistani army and getting the Pakistani army to support the people who are being terrorized in the Northwest instead of making deals with the people terrorizing them?
Bush came the whole campaign in 2000 was launched with, we will do no nation building. But once the Afghanistan war started, I think there was an attempt by people in the administration, people like Colin Powell and others, who realized that, there's no point in just defeating or routing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We have to put a government in place, and we have to give the Afghans something. So there was a lobby, I think, in the administration at that point to do something more than was actually done. And I think that was just shot down by the neoconservatives in the administration. I think the really, as far as U.S. policy towards Pakistan is concerned, the really big tragedy has been that President Bush has continued to support Musharraf. Even though I didn't really recount this, but we've had a very tumultuous 18 months in which there have been political opposition movements against Musharraf, civil society movements against Musharraf. Finally, at the end of last year, he had to declare martial law for 3 months. The second martial law he's imposed for 3 months, in which he again subverted the Constitution, suspended the Constitution, threw out all the judges of the Supreme Court, censored the media, took all sorts of draconian steps. And he was then elections were held, and the elections were, and unfortunately during this period, Benazir Bhutto, the most popular opposition leader, was assassinated. Elections were then held, and the elections led to the complete defeat of the Musharraf party and the fundamentalists. And the most encouraging thing was that the elections were won by the People's Party, which is basically a secular party, and which is very much against extremism. And in the Northwest Frontier, the religious parties who'd been ruling there since 2002 were also defeated by a secular Pashtun party, which believes in non-violence. As part of it, it believes in the Gandhian philosophy of non-violence. Now, I mean, these were just, these have been extraordinary developments, extraordinary positive developments. And unfortunately, and the majority of Pakistanis, the media, the political parties have been urging the US administration to stop siding with Musharraf and back the civilian government. But yet, Bush has still not changed his tune. I mean, Bush is still, 5 days ago, he gave a statement in support of Musharraf when there were rumors that he might resign. So, I mean, I think that has been, and you can imagine what kind of feedback this is having amongst the population. I mean, Pakistanis have voted in a secular party, anti-fundamentalist, anti-army, and, precisely what everyone thought, this is what the Americans would want, and the Americans are supporting the other side. So, it's been an incredibly short-sighted policy. I think it's been ruinous. I think it's going to give the next administration a very difficult time to correct this, as it were. Now, there have been major problems with this new government. The new government is actually a coalition of parties. The coalition has been fighting amongst itself. It hasn't been able to resolve all the backlog of Musharraf's measures he took about the Constitution, about the judges, about the media, and these parties are squabbling amongst themselves as to what to do. So as long as these parties have to get their act together, they have to stabilize the economic and political situation in the country, and then certainly, I think, over a protracted period of time, they can, if you like, slowly encroach upon the army's monopoly of foreign policy towards Afghanistan and policy towards India. But for this, they need international support. They need the backing of the international community. And they certainly don't need the international community to go back Musharraf. Yeah.
I want to take off on the previous question, and which you answered part of it. Just as an aside, when you talk about the next American administration, there's some of us who think there'd be a tremendous difference in what the next American administration or misadministration might be. In other words, if we wind up with McCain, who wants to bomb, if Bush doesn't bomb Iran, McCain might. But my question is really this: a number of both journalists and academics concerned with the Middle East have been noticing a realignment of forces lately. I think think the specific example, rather than go on, is the extent to which Turkey is mediating between Israel and Syria now. And the general picture here is not so much the United States siding with this or that, but in a process of, and I hate to sound too academic, but in a process of hegemonic decline, and is basically pulling out of the world in general. And from what you're saying, this is absolutely the last thing it should be doing, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But we're seeing a decline of American power in a number of ways, and it looks like very soon, when I say soon, the next few years, we'll just be pulling, tucking our tail between our legs and crawling out.
But I agree with you, and of course, you can include China, the rise of China, the rise of India, et cetera, new centers of power. I mean, I agree with you overall. But, these are wars that you started, and you have to end. Iraq is not going to be settled without an American strategy. Yes, I mean, the Turks are talking to this, are getting the Syrians and the Israelis because everybody's so fed up with waiting for the Americans to try and get, talk to the Syrians. And certainly there are whole areas of the world where perhaps your diplomatic initiative will not be needed. And that's a good thing, I think. But the problem, and I'm sure a lot of Americans will be very relieved that maybe issues can be resolved around the world without the Americans having to pay money or, give aid or get involved or whatever. But I think, in these two areas, Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, these were wars that you started and you will have to end them. And in both these places, American leadership is going to be required. I mean, the Europeans are not going to be suddenly negotiating to end the war in Iraq or to end the war in Afghanistan. You have troops there, you have a commitment there, you have had a policy there which has not really been working in either place. And secondly, I would say that the psyche of the people in Iraq and the people in Afghanistan and Pakistan is totally geared towards American intervention, if you like. I mean, in the sense that, the United States has always played a major role in Pakistani politics. Now, it hasn't been a very productive role all the time. Sometimes it has. But unfortunately, both the Afghans and the Pakistanis are looking towards America for a resolution to some of their problems. For example, the civilian government is looking towards America for support, trying to persuade Bush to back off from Musharraf and to give its support to the civilian government. Now, the civilian government in Pakistan is not doing that with any other power. It's not going to the British and saying this. It's not going to the French and saying this. It's saying this to the Americans. And there are historical reasons for that. And the same goes for Afghanistan and Iraq. I think you cannot avoid responsibility for these two places. And frankly, nothing is going to be settled without you.
Last week in the or maybe 2 weeks ago in the Jerusalem Post, there was a headline that said Bush plans to attack Iraq before the end of his term. And that was one of countless indications, I would say, that we have a little better than 50-50 chance that something like that will happen.
You mean Iran?
Iran, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Could you just kind of mull that over out loud and tell us what you think it means for Central Asia?
Well, I mean, it's not so much now, but last year, I think, when there was very seriously, rumored that the Americans were about to strike Iran, I think Iran went on the foreign policy offensive. It started intervening in Afghanistan. It had intervened everywhere where it could attack U.S. interests or U.S. forces. It built up, its clients in Iraq. It built up its clients in Afghanistan. It backed Hamas in the Palestinian territories. It backed Hamas in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and so right across the Middle East, I think it prepared for war. And the Iranian reaction would not be a tit-for-tat attack on American forces directly. They would inflame the whole region, I think. if there was an American attack. And I think the U.S. military was very much aware of this. I think U.S. intelligence was very much aware of this. And I think last year, at least, they seem to have tampered down some of the Bush administration's aspirations to attack Iran, simply that you would inflame the whole region from Lebanon right across the Middle East to Iraq, to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it wouldn't just be Shias who would be resisting. Iran is a majority Shia state. It would not just be Shias resisting. I think Sunnis would be up in arms all over the Arab world, all over the Middle East and South Asia and Central Asia, if something like that happened. This regime in Iran is extremely, it's impossible, it seems, to talk to it. It's very prickly. But I think the problem is that I don't think the U.S. knows what to do with Iran. Even it doesn't want to talk to this regime, and it doesn't have any leverage over this regime. It's trying very hard to curb, sanctions and bank accounts and all the rest of it. But with oil the price it is, the Iranians have enough money coming in to keep them afloat for a very long time, despite whatever the U.S. whatever punishments the U.S. can deal out in terms of sanctions and restricting financial activities. So I think there again we have to wait for the next administration. And it's going to be a very tricky thing as to how Obama has said he will talk to Iran. I mean, obviously that's not going to be done unconditionally. They're going to talk to Iran. I mean, there will have to be a process that will have to start. And I think the first process that needs to start will be some kind of bringing together the regional countries around Iraq. That would be the first reason to talk to Iran.
You mentioned something in your talk that I just want you to clarify a little bit, which is the idea of ethnic solidarity. And ethnic solidarity is a means of why certain political situations take place or military alliances are made. And at the same time, I'm wondering if ethnic solidarity often gets used as an excuse because there's nothing better to kind of bring people together for a different reason. And so in the situation you're talking about in terms of Shia in Iraq, and then also the Pashtun areas, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, for the idea of some sort of sustainable change, what other alternatives can be brought in to bring people together beyond this idea of ethnic solidarity, which seems to kind of be a retreating default in a way?
This is a terribly important question, and it could be a whole lecture in itself. I mean, the answer. But let me try and surmise the problem. With the Taliban. The Taliban present themselves as reflecting Pashtun tradition, culture, aspirations, etc. Now, secular Pashtuns completely dispute this. Secular Pashtuns have an ethnic solidarity based on, a different set of values and traditions, etc. Now, the Taliban are not ethnic Pashtuns. I mean, they do not reflect the aspirations of ethnicity as such. They reflect the aspirations of this new Islamism that has gripped the region. The fact is that they come from one ethnic group enables them to, under the banner of Islamism, rather than necessarily tribal tradition, enables them to link up with fellow Pashtuns in Pakistan and elsewhere. But essentially, what the Taliban did in Afghanistan in the 90s and what they're doing now in Afghanistan and Pakistan is they actually do away with the tribal structure. And they replace the tribal chief or the tribal elders with mullahs. And the mullah in Pashtun society has never been an important figure. He's always been the appendage of the elder or the appendage of the chief. He's one of the service guys. He comes in with the dishes at the back. He doesn't sit at the main table. And the Taliban have elevated the mullah to becoming the arbiter of Pashtun culture and tradition. So women can't go to school, women should be fully, covered, etc. Now, this has created enormous confusion in these societies, where Islamism, if you like, supersedes ethnic solidarity as such. And it doesn't always work. I mean, the Taliban were unable to win support in the non-Pashtun areas not because of the Pashtun factor, because the non-Pashtun, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the other people in Afghanistan, they don't practice Islam like the Taliban do. They practice the Sufi, a much more spiritual or different kind of Islam. So the problem here is that, for example, when General Musharraf has frequently said, the Taliban are reflecting Pashtun culture. And Pashtuns will stand up and abuse Musharraf and say, the Taliban do not reflect Pashtun culture. We represent Pashtun culture, which is we send our girls to school and we do all the other things. I think the whole global jihad philosophy, Islamism, it has muddied the waters enormously, especially in our part of the world. But the particular problem with the Pashtuns is that I think what is the mobilizing factor of the Taliban is, on the one hand, terror and fear and use of terror tactics. On the other is this idea of Islamism and the Sharia state. They want to create a state ruled by Islamic law, Sharia. And they equate that with Pashtun nationalism and Pashtun ethnicity. Other Pashtuns don't. And the failure of Pakistan has been, it has failed to bolster or boost or back the secular Pashtuns. As I say, this party, ANP, that has come into power in the frontier now, it's been out of power for 30 years. And this is a Pashtun party which has very, very good links, except it dislikes the military. It never favored the military's policies in Kashmir and Afghanistan, etc., etc. And they believe in non-violence, which is, I mean, every Pashtun has a gun, I mean, the last thing you'd expect is a Pashtun party believing in the Gandhian philosophy and the Martin Luther King philosophy of non-violence. But they do, and they were voted into office. Now, what the army needs to do, what the international community needs to do, is to put their weight behind these people, so that they can offer the Pashtuns a different paradigm, if you like, of culture and tradition.
Is the army retreating from the northwestern regions because they can't win over the Taliban now? It's become too big a monster to deal with? Or are they still hedging their bets against India? And if that is the case, then does the solution to Afghanistan and the region lie elsewhere, lie outside of Afghanistan?
Well, I think a little bit of all that you said. I mean, I think, first of all, morale is very low in the army because they have launched periodic operations and they've lost 1,000 men. There have been large-scale desertions in the army, etc. And morale is very low. Secondly, but at the same time, they're refusing to give up the leadership of the Afghan Taliban. I mean, I think the real strategic vision of the military is dictated, first of all, by keeping India out of Afghanistan or reducing India's influence in Afghanistan, and secondly, by maintaining the Afghan Taliban leadership sanctuary in Pakistan, even at the expense of the Talibanization of their own territory. I mean, this is what is so what many Pakistanis are finding so appalling right now. That the army is willing to support the Afghan Taliban at the expense of having the Pakistani Taliban Talibanize parts of Pakistan. So it's a very complicated situation. And I think in that is the whole relationship with the Americans. I think the army has judged that the mood in the United States has turned very much against the army and the Musharraf and all that, even in the Bush administration, even though they're not publicly showing it. But Congress is threatening to cut off aid and military aid to Pakistan, etc., etc. So I think, it's a game of brinkmanship. There's just 4 months or 6 months left to Bush. He's a lame duck president. This is the time to push the envelope, to show the next administration also that the Pakistan army will have to be cajoled with much more money and more aid and more pressure, carrot and stick, but more carrots than even that Bush is giving. So I think there are many reasons why what is happening is happening. So I think it would be difficult to pin down one issue.
I wonder, 2 questions. Can you talk a bit about the Karzai regime, the government? And then the second, the question of the North and the East. What's the situation there? I was especially curious about Herat and the city in the north whose name I can't remember.
Mazar-e-Sharif.
Yeah.
And Herat, you said?
Herat, yeah.
Well, there has been over the last 2-3 years enormous disillusionment with the Karzai regime. The Taliban have been quite separately being able to recruit Afghans on the basis of the failure of the Western alliance, and the failures of nation building, but also the tactics being used by the US military that have, killed large numbers of civilians, the excessive use of aerial bombardment, excessive use of artillery, etc., But at the same time, I think there is now a major motivating factor for the Taliban, which is really the failure of Karzai to deal more effectively with issues that are under his control. And I list 3 of them. I mean, the first is better governance. He chooses the people, the governors in the provinces, the police chiefs, the bureaucrats, the ministers in the cabinet, etc., and he's had very, very poor, generally speaking, very poor choices. And these choices are a result of political compromises rather than competence for the job. Secondly has been the extraordinary rise of corruption within the regime. Ministers in the cabinet, and that, of course, has been pushed not only because of this aid money that has come in, but largely because of the drugs trade. Many senior people are involved in drugs trafficking, or at least giving a pass to traffickers. That has increased corruption, and that has kept the drugs trade alive. I mean, on the one hand, you've got Al-Qaeda ripping off the traffickers, and on the other hand, you have these senior ministers taking their cut from the traffickers. So I think Karzai's reputation is very badly damaged. As you know, there's a donors meeting in Paris day after tomorrow. Karzai is asking for $50 billion for the next 5 years. I think he'll have to give far more to the Western donors rather than ask them. He'll have to make some serious announcements this time on corruption and on these issues. Next year there will be elections in Afghanistan. I was in Kabul about 10 days ago, and there's enormous speculation as to who is going to stand against him. And most people are probably I think the majority of people, would not like to see another 5-year term of Karzai. He is going to stand. He will stand. How he manages to what kind of alliance he puts together, etc., which of the opposition figures stand, what kind of alliances they put together, all this has become terribly important. But what is really important is whether the election will be held, because 1/3 of the country is basically under siege because of the insurgency. Herat, simply put, these Mazar-e-Sharif has actually, the north has done very well. It's not faced by an insurgency. For example, the north now has power from Central Asia. They've got electricity. There's been more development up there. Mazar-e-Sharif is quite a thriving city. There are still enormous problems of governance there, because a lot of the drugs trafficking is through Mazar and goes into Central Asia. So a lot of the money and the progress up in the north has been because of drugs rather than because of aid money as such. But nevertheless, there has been. Herat too, because the Iranians, Herat has traditionally been an Iranian city. It is part of the Persian Empire and all the rest of it. So Herat has, been provided electricity by the Iranians. The Iranians have built roads there. They have there's a lot of trade between Herat and also Herat is the new export-import route for Afghanistan. Traditionally, Afghanistan imported through Karachi, through Pakistan. But because of the Taliban in the way and bad relations with Pakistan, and the fact that the Iranians and the Indians together have rebuilt roads which go up from the Iranian Gulf ports and enter Afghanistan from Herat. So our Herat is benefiting enormously from this trade. So a lot of the materials for rebuilding and reconstruction and cement and materials for the armies for the Western armies are also coming through this part also.
The Taliban optionality for the Pakistan army being as important as it is in Afghanistan, combined with the fact that the army in Pakistan is really much stronger than any democratically elected government, are you really hopeful that with the change of government in Pakistan, that can really be achieved, that the army can be convinced to pull the support back from the from supporting Talibanization of Afghanistan and subsequently in Pakistan?
Look, I mean, this is a very slow process. It started in the 90s to some extent. I mean, I give you two instances. Benazir Bhutto met Rajiv Gandhi in 1989, and if that dialogue had worked, it was scarpered by the army. It was just undermined by the army. If that dialogue had worked, maybe we wouldn't have had a 15-year war in Kashmir. Maybe all sorts of things. Good things may have happened. Nawaz Sharif in 99 met with Vajpayee, just in the hope of brokering peace with India, and that also was undermined by Musharraf, who then went and did Kargil, fought the Kargil war. So what I'm trying to say is that the civilians are the natural allies of peaceful relations with neighbors, good relations with neighbors, trade, investment, democracy, etc., etc. Now, what is needed is time and consistency, in the sense that civilian governments have to be allowed to last. What happened in the 90s was we had 4 elected governments, and they were all dismissed prematurely. Now, if this happens again now, obviously the civilians are not going to have time to be able to encroach. I use the word encroach because that literally, it's a creeping kind of, it's positional warfare, if you like. To change the army, you have to mobilize parliament, you have to mobilize the media, you have to mobilize civil society, and all this is going to take time, and it's going to need good governance by the civilian government. It's not going to happen overnight, and it also needs American and international support to be able to do this. For example, if I give you one example, in 7 years, we have not had a single debate in Parliament. It was Musharraf's own rigged Parliament. We did not have a single debate about relations with India. There was no debate about relations with Afghanistan. Now, I hope this government will quickly have a debate in Parliament. Now, what will happen in the debate in Parliament? For the first time, a lot of sort of the opposition parliamentarians will come out very strongly against the army and what the army has been doing and what its policies are. Now, all that is then, that snowballs into all sorts of other things, the media, civil society, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very slow process. I mean, Pakistan has been grappling with civil-military tensions for its entire life, for 60 years. This has been the crux of the lack of stability in Pakistan. The inability of the army and the civilians to come together, or the army to accept civilian rule. I hope it's going to take time.
One of the sillier moments during our recent primary was each candidate was reassuring the American people that they would kill foreigners. Senator Clinton was trying to reassure us that she would nuke Iran if so necessary, and Senator Obama assured us that he would send missiles into Pakistan.
Yeah.
How do people in Iran and Pakistan receive these messages? And in light of today's missile attack in the Northwest Territories, I mean, what is the Pakistan's, what are people's reactions there besides the initial outcry?
I think, certainly in the tribal areas, where there's enormous influence of the Taliban, it leads to a very negative reaction. Less so, I think, now in the rest of Pakistan, simply because I think Pakistanis are now very, very fed up with these extremists and what they're doing. But certainly, I think, in the tribal areas, it's been very negative. The other reaction has been a kind of inward-looking reaction, that they blame Musharraf more and more for these policies. Either Musharraf, which varies from either Musharraf is an American stooge, so he has to be condemned and further condemned for that, or he has lost all influence with the Americans, and the Americans are now bombing or missiling Pakistani territory without even taking permission from the army. So I think the reaction is basically twofold, both at the U.S. and inward. But I think there's a growing disenchantment with the extremists. The kind of gut reaction there was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, an American missile hitting, and the whole country would come out and protest, and there'd be calls for Musharraf to resist the American blah blah blah. I mean, that has subsided to an enormous extent because now people are seeing the danger at home. Okay.
Mr. Rashid, most of the information that we get in this country when it comes to Waziristan is that it's a completely fanatical, lawless part of Pakistan where the government has little to no jurisdiction over the people who live there. And I think it was about 8 months or so ago, there was kind of an obscure issue that came up, which was that groups of Uzbeks had been attacked by Waziri people. And it got a lot of press, it got a lot of attention in Pakistan, but I never found any satisfactory answers as to whether or not this was a really serious incident. Were these sort of al-Qaeda Uzbeks who had somehow managed to fall out of favor with the local Waziri people, or was it, actually a matter that was blown up out of proportion? And I wondered if you knew anything about that incident.
There was a conflict between the local Pashtun Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, and the Central Asian group, which is basically called the Islamic Movement for Uzbekistan. There was a conflict, but I think it was blown out of proportion because the Americans were just at that point celebrating their abilities in Anbar and other provinces in Iraq to be able to create this civil war between Iraqi tribes who had turned against al-Qaeda. And I think the Americans were hoping that maybe this could be repeated in the tribal areas. That we can have, if you like, not the good guys, but the bad guys hitting the worst guys, So the bad guys being the Pakistani Taliban, hitting the worst guys being the Al-Qaeda elements. And that is not the case. I mean, the Americans are not going to have the capability, and nor can anyone else have to launch a kind of civil war process within the tribes and in Waziristan. And I agree with you on the painting of the picture of Waziristan. I think the real problem has been that the Taliban, once they started their activities in Waziristan, the Pakistani Taliban, they basically eliminated anyone opposed to them. So they killed elders by the dozen who were opposed to them or who were pro-government. They forced thousands of people to leave the area who were not pro-Taliban. So eventually it was a kind of ethnic cleansing within their own ethnic group, which left the whole area in the hands of the Taliban. So you either supported the Taliban or you were out. You were either killed or you were driven out. And today there are perhaps as many as 200 to 300,000 refugees. When we're talking a total population of about 3 to 4 million only in this area. Maybe, they're up to 500,000, 500,000 refugees, Pashtuns from the tribal areas living outside the tribal areas because they've been driven out by the Taliban. So, and this is the job. I mean, if you want to encourage change in the tribal areas, this is what the army should be doing. You should be encouraging these people to come back. You should be protecting these people. You should be providing them the aid and the wherewithal so that they can restart their lives, etc., etc., and then protecting them from the Taliban. But this is not happening. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.